In non-Western traditions as well, such as Buddhism, too, there are very old similar sentiments about humanity being unified because of our common. So the cosmopolitan philosophy holds that each person, while a citizen of a city, a nation, is a central to the cosmopolitan philosophy is the idea that each human being, regardless of nationality and background, has value and certain rights, such as the right to life, right to freedom of movement, freedom of speech, and so on. Also central to cosmopolitanism is the idea that despite this universality of human values and rights, there are cultural differences among particular groups of people that are to be respected as well. The tension between these universal rights and the universal acceptance of cultural differences is what makes certain aspects of the cosmopolitan philosophy paradoxical. How, for example, and you may have wondered this in your everyday lives, how, for example, are differences in cultures about what rights are universal or to be prioritized to be handled? One culture places greater emphasis on freedom of speech, for example, while another values freedom from want. How are such differences to be understood and if possible resolved? As a professor of philosophy at an institution of formal higher education, I see it as one of my responsibilities to train young people, like be able to see these tensions and to be able to be global citizens. And ironically, this involves seeing how conflicts between global values on the one hand and national cultural values on the other sometimes come into conflict, and sometimes they can be resolved. Um, I really hope to do this as a philosopher. Is there a question? Oh, I hope to do this as a philosopher, in a way that doesn't lead young people into thinking that this view called cultural relativism is correct. I don't know if you've heard of cultural relativism. It's an old position. It's basically the cultural relativist holds that there are no universal norms for morality, for justice. One culture may be different from another, and there's no universal. I think that by fostering in young minds an awareness and a respect for different ways of thinking among cultural groups and nations, and yet also training these minds to derive abstract universal principles, young people can become capable of global citizenry. They become citizens of both their own countries and of the world at the same time. So, as
We have some.
oh, okay, yeah.
One.
Well, as one was saying in this very nice intro, I wrote a book on paradoxes. I like to think in terms of paradoxes. There is a kind of paradox that's involves training people to be global citizens, and I think it's useful when we talk about formal education. So, I mentioned earlier that Cosmopolitan has this philosophy about everyone being a global citizen has two main components. It holds that we are all global citizens, though also citizens of nations, states, and cities, and so on. Because of that, we have certain universal, inalienable rights as human beings. It also holds, though, that there's a diversity of opinions that are found in different cultures, and these are to be respected. So The British-born Ghanaian-American philosopher Kwame Anthony Appiah has given a famous example from his own life about how this might work. In patrilineal Britain, that is where the descent is traced along the father's line, the children's financial being is primarily the responsibility of the father. However, in matrilineal Ghana, where he also lived, where the well-being of the responsibility for the financial well-being of a child falls to the mother's side of the family, in particular the mother's brother. This uncle is called the wofa, and when the child needs to go to school or get married or anything like this, this is the wofa's financial responsibility. So the first component of cosmopolitanism holds that there are these universal principles of justice, of morality, and so on. So, for example, children should be taken care of. Or some of the example, maybe children have a right to be cared for. This would be an example of a universal moral claim. Yet, according to Tu, there is a wide range of ways that might be acceptable to meet this universal obligation. So, one way is to have the father be responsible, the responsible party. Another is to have the maternal uncle be responsible. Both methods potentially can work well. Cosmopolitanism, philosophy about being world citizens, holds that as long as the universal obligations are met, as long as the children aren't suffering or harmed in any way, then the cultural details as to how these needs are met are irrelevant. So there are cases, though, when the two claims of global citizenship be in conflict. For example, there is a standard cultural practice of having children cared for by, for example, slaves captured from a neighboring state. A problem arises in such. Well, it is a universal principle that children should be adequately cared for. In this case, the way in which the practice is done is trouble. Although potentially very good given by, to children by their caregivers, practice could not be justified on the grounds that it is one equally good on many ways to satisfy the moral obligation. This exposes a paradox about global citizenship. Both central claims look fine, yet there are cases when they both can't be true at the same time. So one way to think about paradoxes is that sets of mutually inconsistent claims that you can't have at both at the same time, but they both look pretty good, so they both look true. So there are cases. So in this case, we have two claims: universal truths about morality and justice, and the second one is that there is a value and they have to be. Assume you are a citizen of a community which this practice is licensed both by culture and law. As a citizen of both a country and the world, what should you do? So this is a kind of question that somebody training to be a global citizen might ask him or herself. It follows that from the law of the land. If you follow the law of the land in this case and do what is culturally acceptable in this case, then you will be violating a universal principle of human rights, namely the right of each human being to be free and not enslaved by others. If, on the other hand, you obey the universal principle and help, for example, free some enslaved caregivers, you are violating the laws and cultural mores of your own country. In other words, parts 1 and 2 of the paradox cannot be adhered to at the same time. So then, paradoxes invite solutions. How do we resolve these things? How do we, deal with these tensions and then move on and be good global citizens? Some strategies involve, for example, rejecting one part of it, the paradox. So an example of that, as I mentioned in the beginning, was that one possibility would be to reject the idea that there are universal norms or universal rights that have to be respected. So, for example, the cultural relativist, for him or her, the mere fact that there are such a diversity of approaches to the care of the young is proof that no one universal guideline is possible. I think this type of relativism, I think of it as kind of lazy in a way, because it, in a sense, the person arguing this way refuses to make that conceptual leap to the universal from the particular. And in another sense, I think it's bad in the sense that it's a position that contradicts itself. To claim that there are no universal claims of justice and morality, presumably, is to make a universal claim about justice and morality. In other words, right, if I say there are no moral truths, and there are no big truths with a capital T, and so on, I'm making a claim about the kinds of truths there are. So aren't I, in fact, violating the very claim that I'm trying to make? So there is also a danger in cultural relativism in that it doesn't seek, it doesn't have a kind of motivation to end atrocities or things like that, because these are particular practices might be, licensed in some way by a particular culture or nation. So, so solving this paradox, I think, is by appealing to cultural relativism is perhaps not the best way to go about it. Alternatively, we could have solved this kind of problem by keeping the first claim and rejecting the second. In other words, we could hold that there are universal principles of justice and morality, and that different approaches to these problems are simply wrong or should be altered somehow. This approach has certain dangers inherent in it too, in the sense that it is very hard to distinguish cultural norms from universal norms. And it's very easy to impose one's own cultural assumptions and expectations on the idea of what's universal justice and so on. So so that's very much a danger, to see one's own customs as the universal norms. So the guidelines put forth on the most abstract universal level must take the form and be realized in a particular country or culture. To even talk about justice and morality involves speaking a language, and languages themselves carry within them certain values and certain ways of ordering concepts. For example, the indigenous language from Australia, Gyeongju, does not contain the words front and back, and only use east, west, north, and south to refer to location. So it makes sense that there would be an acceptable range of ways to meet universal demands of justice that still allow for different ways of organizing the reality around us. Thus, to give up the universal acceptance of cultural difference is not a good approach either. I think the paradox should be solved, and I think one of the things that's interesting for young people to think about with respect to these kinds of tensions is how can you have both at the same time? Because often in our everyday lives, we find ourselves having competing obligations, let's say, to family, to city, to culture, to the universe, to so on, to gender and whatnot. So how do we do this? So one way is to, just accept this paradox, but hold, kind of what's called, maybe it's a little, what's called ad hoc approach to these types of things, which holds that you could have all of these things at the same time. So, for example, we could acknowledge universal rights and principles of justice and still acknowledge cultural differences are to be respected, and these two things are compatible, even when they seem to conflict. The conflict between the two may be only a surface incompatibility, and we can be global citizens and citizens of a particular community or whatever at the same time. So in the case of the enslaved caregivers, for example, The practice cannot be an acceptable way to meet the demand that children be cared for because it violates another universal demand, the demand that human beings should remain free. So one way to solve these paradoxes of global citizenry that every person who becomes an adult must face is to say, well, maybe we could alter these claims and be, in such a way that one takes priority. In this case, the universal claim takes priority. If I have time, there's another paradox, and I talk about education to how education specifically is going to relate to that. Do I have time for one more paradox? Or? Okay, so this one is a sort of a thought experiment that comes from the philosopher Peter Singer. Imagine that you're walking in a park and you see a child drowning in a shallow fountain. You can easily wade into the fountain and save the child. You don't have to take off time to take off your shoes, though, so you'll have to sacrifice those in order to save the child's life. What should you do? Most people, when faced with such a dilemma, would say that the value of the shoes is far outweighed by the value of the child's life, and that the morally responsible act in this case is to wade into the fountain and save the child's life. Yet, the value of that same pair of shoes is enough to save the life of a child who is starving or in desperate need of medical attention in a far more distant part of the world. Think about these goals here on the wall, and sure they have to, so definitely have to, some of them have to do with addressing global poverty. Don't we have the same obligation to save the child by, for example, donating money that would be spent on those shoes to save the child's life? So what's the difference, in other words, between the child that's drowning in the fountain and the one on the other part of the world who could be saved by just having some donation and some medical care and so on? Perhaps we can all agree that we do have some obligations in this case, perhaps not. Assume we all say yes. There is no relevant difference between the two children. Both are in danger of dying. We have the ability to save both lives, so we ought to help in both cases. Here, though, another problem arises. There isn't just one such child in danger, but if my numbers are correct, you guys probably know better than I, 21,000 children each day are in such dire circumstances. So following that principle that we should help save a child's life when we can, would change the quality of most of our own lives if we followed that principle step by step. For most of us, this would mean giving up any extra money that isn't necessary for our own survival or the survival of our families. Should we send all of our extra money to help save as many of those children as we can? Do other obligations outweigh this one? Here, people's intuitions start to differ immensely. Peter Singer suggests that we do have moral obligations in this way. And what is necessary for us, except for anything that's over and above what's necessary for us and for our families, we should, in fact, give to help others. Some hold, however, that while saving the drowning child in the fountain is a moral obligation, we are under no such obligation to help people in distant parts of the world. This is a tough paradoxes, and some paradoxes don't really admit of easy solutions. And I think this is one of them. The reason why this type of problem is hard to resolve is that when we look at how our ideas about morality and justice and equality come into being, usually these concepts were created with much smaller groups of people in mind. Our ideas about right and wrong were originally proposed with tribes or clans in mind, and did not consider the entire world. A while ago, it would have been inconceivable to think that we could help that child in a very distant part of the world. It was simply impractical, impossible. Yet we can now do this. As Anthony Appiah mentioned in a scene from the film The Examined Life, most of us see more people walking down a crowded street than our ancestors saw in their entire lives. Up until very recently, moral obligations to those so far away were thought not to exist due to practical limitations. Right? It was, how do you give the food to somebody all the way across the world, right? Now that these practical limitations have been removed, it is hard to apply these concepts more globally. The concept of a global village is in some way inaccurate. We can know everyone in a small village. We cannot know everyone in the world. We must accept and value and respect the rights of people with whom we cannot speak and with whom we may never lay eyes on. That's very different from the idea of a village. That is a very different kind of moral demand than was previously required of human beings. And this is something that I think the youth are going to, young people are going to be facing more and more, this idea that our moral obligations don't extend just to, the people right next to us, but to people on the other side of the planet. And so because we have this ability now, we also have this responsibility in some ways. So this suggests that ideas about charity and their obligations to those far away are not fully coherent, and it's up to the youth and the young minds to work out things coherent. So if what I've been saying so far has been on target, I think we can solve that first paradox I mentioned by saying that we can have both universal norms and principles of justice and individual community-based norms as well. And the second paradox requires some going back to the drawing board with our moral obligations and rethinking. What this shows, I think, is that one of the most important things to know as a global citizen is when cultural practices are simply different but acceptable, when they violate basic universal principles of human rights, and when the very concepts of morality and justice seem to break down. In order to be able to discern the difference between a merely different perspective on meeting a global injunction on the one hand, and a violation of human rights on the other hand, a global citizen must be able to separate him or herself from the assumption that only his or her cultural assumptions are correct, and acknowledge that other strategies for dealing with important issues of human rights can potentially be just as good as their own culture's approach. In addition, a global citizen must be able to acknowledge the commonality and worth of all human beings. Also, the global citizen must be able to abstract from individual and cultural practices to universal principles. And lastly, the global citizen must accept that the concepts previously thought to be good ways to determine one's moral obligations to one's community need to be revised in the global context. To create an educated global citizenry of this, capable of this, institutions of formal education must foster in young people an understanding, appreciation, and respect for cultures other than their own. In addition, formal education must train young people in the process of reasoning that is crucial to be able to discern these universal claims. A philosopher that we don't often associate with this idea of a global citizen argued that future rulers should spend much time in fields devoted to abstract, including mathematics to start, and later the study of philosophy. It was the training of the mind away from the local, what he might have called the petty concerns, to the universal concepts like justice and beauty that was crucial to the training of those who would eventually make decisions for the whole community. One last thought on the question of how people become educated as global citizens. In her book, Educating Humanity, philosopher Martha Nussbaum, Cultivating Humanity, Martha Nussbaum, brought up something that I have yet to mention, namely something called the narrative imagination. We exercise our narrative imagination by putting ourselves in the place of a character in a story. Part of developing a respect for the cultures of others is the ability to imagine oneself, at least in part, in somebody else's place. Just as it is important to be able to think beyond the limits of one's own history and culture, one must be able to imagine what it might be like to be in another culture and have a different history. To learn how to do this, works of imagination that represent different cultures can be learned. In learning these, we use our imagination to place ourselves in the perspective of another. When we are able to accomplish this, it seems there are no real foreigners, and we can see that we are all cosmopolites, that is, citizens of the world. So, so just in sum, I think then the key things then are, an awareness of other cultures. That's part of what formal education has to do, and appreciation and understanding of them. Training in the ability to think abstractly, to go from the local to the universal and back again, especially with regards to questions about justice and morality and so on. And then this idea of a narrative imagination, this idea that I can put myself in the place of somebody in the far distant part of the world and imagine what it must be like. So these, I think, are three key things, and they help satisfy, I think, and provide an understanding for how we can deal with these paradoxes that come with being a global citizen.
Thank you very much, Professor Ponso. That was a very interesting and very elaborated definition for global citizens. These paradoxes are definitely something that we need to think more about. And as youth, we should really be more encouraged to participate in these discussions. Thank you very much for your participation. We also have today Mr. Javed Rissaye. Has different experiences with the United Nations. He worked with the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees in Afghanistan, in Kabul, Afghanistan. He conducted needs assessments and monitoring and evaluation of reintegration projects. He also worked with the United Nations Development Program in Kunduz, Afghanistan. He was a program officer who identified local implementing partners for the DDR program, and he also was an acting regional office manager who managed all administrative, financial, operational, and security matters for DPI's regional office, implementing the nationwide disarmament, demobilization, reintegration (DDR). He also worked with the Open Society Foundation in New York City as a program administration specialist. He worked on the eligibility assessments of current and prospective grantee organizations. He also did grant making and identification study and recommendation of optimal projects for funding. He holds a Bachelor's of Arts of Political Sciences from Tufts University. Thank you very much for coming today. So the stage is yours.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm a little inhibited by the excellent lecture by Professor Kwanzaa, and kept me thinking about the idea of global citizenship, but also paradoxes that comes along and how we should think about it. And something that really struck me was that we're all global citizen at heart, and that's what I remember. Being born and raised in Afghanistan and always dreaming to go get quality education, hopefully in the United States, and that did happen. That I always thought that, I belong to the world, and even like the way I saw the world was that language is not sort of specific to certain people. Even I thought religion is not specific to certain people. It's just things that as we grew up, we absorb, and then that becomes our identity. And so kind of with an open mind in terms of reaching out to people, and that's how I've been conducted my life. So just quickly about the importance of formal education and role of youth. I would say that Of course, formal education, quality education is the foundation for basically everything you want to do in life. You'll be able to express yourself better, to articulate what you want. It stretches your knowledge horizon, makes you wiser, and gives you the tools for whatever you want to do in your life, whatever dreams you have. And it starts from personal, goes to small groups of family and friends, and then to the society. And I think that you know, in terms of human development, once you feel like you know yourself, you know your capabilities, you have a good, pretty good understanding of what's good and bad in life, and you pursue like that, you do affect the people around you, and as a result, you also contribute to the goodness of the civil society, and and I think that's very important. Youth can always do so much for promoting and making sure that promoting education, but also making sure that they take the advantage when they are young to build themselves, and then help people around themselves, and create as a result a thriving civil society. I think that I would say that, you know, first thing that you can do is to um, um, appreciate the time and the energy that you have. Really, I mean, um, you know, once you get older, it's like time flies fast, and you're like, what happened to days and weeks? When you're young, in like 2 minutes, you can learn so much. You're excited about life, and I think that you should not take that for granted, and jump into opportunities that get you going in terms of education. I would say that work hard, and from my experience, I would say that finding a mentor for yourself is very helpful. I mean, there is formal education. You have your books, you have teacher, you have your parents, your friends. You always hear good things from the society. But I think that what I found very useful was also to find a mentor, somebody you can work with, ask their experiences and their and knowledge and advice, and go with that. And there would be a time that actually you would be able to pass on what you learned from others in form of mentoring. And in today's world, really, I mean, internet is changing the world, of course, and you can find basically anything you want on the internet. So you know, we have to, kids have to be careful about how much time they spend and what kind of sites they go. But like, search anything, like groups, organizations that scholarships, civic groups, whoever is you think that you will benefit from them in terms of education, but also in terms of general knowledge, which is also important. Um, so I'm gonna end there, but I'll be happy to discuss once you have questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rosier, for your comments. I would like to bring a discussion today regarding or the topics that we have selected for the conference in the NGO conference in Korea. We have selected three main topics for the youth caucus, and I think you could help us contribute in a discussion about these topics. So I would like to start first with the a formal education in conflict and post-conflict situation, and I would like to direct that a question to you regarding these matter, since you have worked in the DDR programs in with the UNDP and the High Commission of Refugees. So I would like to, what do you think that we youth the youth education for the youth should be in these conflict and post-conflict situations?
Yeah, thank you. First of all, I should say DDR is not Dance Revolution.
Yeah.
It's disarmament, demobilization, reintegration, and a post-conflict program where with the help of the United Nations, the government will implement uh, disarmament of formal groups to pursue civilian life. In terms of youth and formal education and in conflict and post-conflict, I would say, and again, I'll talk about that from personal experience in Afghanistan, where I grew up. One problem post-conflict that I saw in terms of education was that teachers weren't paid enough, and that was really a problem. A lot of teachers, unfortunately, couldn't attend their classes well. They didn't have the heart to really work hard and engage with the students because their mind was in, earning an extra dollar or Afghani to add to the table, so the effect of that was really, I think, very bad because the students didn't get the attention that really needed. So, so that's something that I remember. For example, one of my teachers, missed a class from time to time, and then I saw him one day selling bananas on the street, and I was like, that's legitimate. He had to do that, and then you would think about the contrast between his life and his responsibilities, and putting food for his kids, and then the responsibility of putting everything for teachers. I think that every teacher has that in heart. That's why they're teachers. But so, but that's one problem. During the conflict, of course, security is number one problem. Wars, skirmishes around the place, insurgency that stops a lot of kids from going to school. And unfortunately, in Afghanistan, we had really bad experiences of schools being burned, and we had some cases students being poisoned, and of course the problem of having every boy and girl to go to school is always a problem in Afghanistan. But there was growing civil society in Afghanistan, and a lot of parents, if the conditions are right in terms of security, they really want to send their kids to schools. I remember working with the High Commission for Refugees. We traveled from village to village, and I talked to a lot of elders and parents, and this is 2002 and 2003. Most of them send their kids to schools, girls and boys, but a lot of them who couldn't, they shared enthusiasm in sending their kids to school. But it was like, we can, because we got night letters from Taliban that stopping them from feeling safe to send their kids. So security is one big problem, but also then there is the question of economy. Where you have war, economy goes down, and you have displacement of brain drain, displacement of a lot of teachers. That's another problem. So it totally changes into different dynamics. Sorry, I'm switching between post-conflict and conflict as I remember things, but there are always challenges, and I think that given those challenges, the youth, again, they have the energy, the power, the time, the interest to help those in whatever capacity they do. And I would say that a lot of times attending the formal groups and sort of associations that promote education and educational institutions, civic participation is helpful.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Musili. Do you have anything to add, Professor Ferguson?
Yeah, I found that very interesting. You should say this, that one of the things you need to learn is really to feel safe enough to learn, to feel like learning something doesn't cut into your ability to survive, or so on. So right, it's really interesting. I mean, there's such a conflict between these different kinds of needs, let's say, that need to be satisfied, and where does education fall within this?
Thank you very much, Professor Kosu. The other section of the caucus that we have in the conference is directed to innovative education. Eh, and I would like to direct that section to you, Professor Kosu. What is the, do you have any thoughts about innovative education and way of attracting more of the youth to education and be more engaged to it? Um, so,
Yeah, well, I think, the most innovative education starts with the student, right? The young person who wants to learn, let's say. And one way to think about how we learn is that we take something that's our own experience that we already have knowledge of, and sort of connect it in with something we don't have knowledge of. And so I think for young people who are interested in formal education, degree grants, that you've been teaching for 23 years in an institution of higher education, I think that one of the benefits of that kind of education is that there's a kind of rigor that's involved. In other words, you don't just pick and choose some things that you like and other things that you don't, but the things that may not be particularly easy for you, you're particularly interested in. Sometimes it's important to know those things anyway. And so with a formal education, well, I think one of the benefits of that is making people learn things that they might not have personally chosen, but that they need nonetheless. In terms of innovation, I think that as things change, needs change, there are some basic universal things that stay the same, but that within the context of an unfolding world where there's such a great amount of technology and such great uses and a fast-moving world, where the information age, it's very important to stay focused on some kinds of core values because a new article comes out every day, and the new studies are done, new political developments happen, new works of art, new shows come on, new films happen. There is a sense that things are all often constantly changing, and but yet underneath them, there are some basic skills that are needed. I have, since I've been in the higher education for a long time, I know that a lot of employers, for example, are very much interested, not so much in particular vocational knowledge, but in the ability, basic underlying abilities of people. Can they reason? Can they write? Can they understand quantitative things? Can they do math and so on? And so I would suggest, I think the greatest innovation is when you take those core things and you apply them to novel situations, and that's what innovation
very interesting. Thank you very much. Would you like to add something to innovative education, Mr. Isaiah?
I think that's good.
Okay, great. So I thank you everyone for watching us right now. Remember to tweet your questions or to submit your question to YouTube or to Google Hangout. Remember we have the hashtag UN NGO 2016, hashtag DPI NGO. Lastly, for our discussion here, I would like to hear your thoughts on youth employment and youth unemployment, especially for those who graduate from college and they go to the real world and are looking for a job, and some of these jobs require a lot of experience, and it's very hard for the youth to find a job that it's paid well and it's also related to their majors, to their bachelors. So I would like to hear your comments on that.
Oh, it's a tough situation. I sit at commencement, where everyone gets their degrees, like the graduation ceremony, and I think, what's going to happen with these people? I find that you know, uh, it, student loan debt is often an issue here. It's an important concern. But it also, if people what they find of value and meaningful to them, that in and of itself has value. And so the job, I believe, sort of comes as a result of that. I teach philosophy, and of course, you know, there aren't many job listings for philosophers out there in the help wanted ads or on Craigslist. But those basics, again, I'd like to emphasize those basic skills. Can someone think? Can someone reason? Can someone problem solve? Can someone do math? Can someone express him or herself? I think these are all the things that in a rapidly changing global environment that keep becoming, that maintain their relevance even despite bad job markets and shifting career prospects and so on. So I'd suggest focus on those key skills that not everyone has and that employers really need.
Thank you very much, Professor Ponce.
Yeah, I mean, youth employment is a serious concern, serious issues, and some countries deal with staggering statistics of youth unemployment. And so it depends on the context. I would say, once you're done with college, I would absolutely agree with what Professor Kwanzaa said about honing on the skills that you need to have, and something that you get good at. It's a discover yourself as well, what you're good at, you can strengthen your skills that you have, but also you can expand and you see what you can do better. I think that with resilience, with sharpening your skills, with and again, my point about mentoring is really that I've benefited a lot in my life from mentoring and finding a mentor and questions and be engaged. After I finished my college, and I came to college late in my life, but once I finished it, I applied for jobs, and I got it after 1 year. So I waited 1 year to get a proper job. It was a fantastic job with the Open Society Foundation, but I waited 1 year. During that time, I didn't sit. I was working on some languages. I was doing the survival job. I was translating and just sort of living off of that. And I kept applying, kept talking to people, sharpening my resume. And cover letters are very, very important. Employers usually look at, see there if you have something that has some traction in that cover letter, that it resonates with what they do, they shortlisted and read it more. But if you have something generic, it's not going to help. So I would say with working on your skills, with believing in yourself, with resilience, your mentor help you with your application, you will get there maybe sooner than I did.
Thank you very much for sharing the experience with us, Mr. Ressaye. And I would like to hear some questions from the people online. So Ivana will help us with that.
So for the last part of the Google Hangouts, I have come in with some questions from our viewers and what I have listened to from the speeches and what I thought of it. So the first question is from Carisha, the co-chair of the Youth Subcommittee, and she asked, how does technology impact formal education?
Someone would like to answer it?
Okay, so, I mean, obviously we're here, we're having a Google Hangout. It allows for education to take place in the virtual realm and physical realm. There are options that are available to people today, online options to blended learning, or part of the in the real world situation, and then a part online. All of these things are available now. So there's this vast store of information. But I think sometimes what's lacking is like substance. You can Google things, you can find things on Wikipedia, but to have the depth of knowledge and depth of understanding, it's like the difference between going to WebMD to figure out what's wrong with you or going to a doctor who has had 30 years of experience. The two aren't quite the same, right? So the idea is that, you know, technology is useful, certainly, but there's still, you know, there's you have to find the right source of knowledge, let's say, and not all things fly on the screen or you hear quickly or that counts as worthy of our attention.
Thank you very much. So do we have any other questions?
Yeah, we have another question from a viewer, and she asked for Professor Gyeongju. Can you please elaborate more about accepting different cultures for global citizenship and cultural relativity?
Right. So there is this tension here. Thanks for the question. It's a tough one, right? So, you know, at the time that Diogenes is writing and the time that a lot of the cultural relativism happens, it's a period where there's like a situation like New York City or any global city right now, where there's this multiple there are these multiple cultures, there are these multiple ways of looking at things. And of course, there's always a tendency to say, just because of that you know, there's no truth with a capital T, or no morality with a capital M, or no justice with a capital J. So I think that what confronting and what being exposed to different ways of looking at the world is both enlightening, because it allows us to see the way our own cultural assumptions aren't necessarily universal. So I think that's a real benefit of it. But I think it's also important to remember that despite all of our differences, there are these shared humanity. There is this shared humanity, this shared obligation that we all have to each other. I don't know if that answers this person's question or not.
That answers the question. And another question that we got online was, how can youth engage in creating a curriculum of formal education in local communities? So kind of balancing between the informal and the local communities and the formal education in the curriculum. So how do those be merged?
I would be Professor to take on that academic question as well.
Oh, okay. I think that's a great
if
question.
that's okay with you.
I think that's a great question. You know, I've been teaching for, as I said, in a standard university for 20 years. Some of the most amazing learning that takes place happens in almost informal contexts, and, you know, the holiday, you know, party, or the trip that you go with a group of students, or the students themselves think, oh, I want to do an independent study, and so this is what I want to learn about. So I think that there can be like this negotiation that, like, don't accept the standard curriculum as it's presented to you. You can, you know, question it. And that's what education is about. It's about making it relevant to you specifically, your own community, your own questions, your own concerns. A good education takes those things that are very specific to you and local to you, and then informs it with bigger issues, with bigger things, world things related to the world and to other cultures and so on. So I would suggest establishing some kinds of partnerships with local institutions, and finding, you know, sympathetic people, because we're out there. I think people are out there, definitely.
And going a little further into the same question, how can students impact the curriculum that we have in school, in colleges and schools?
Great. Well, you know, I always say that it's really all about the students. Sometimes students vote simply by what courses they sign up for. I think asking an instructor that you're friendly with, you know, I was interested in this, and I know, you know, you might find an instructor who has a similar interest. So there's more power in the student for determining the curriculum and what kinds of issues are brought up. I remember one time I had a student who called me out on some issue that, and she said, you didn't put, you're talking about a lot of just, contemporary American philosophers here. Why don't you bring in something else? And I think a really thoughtful education is, is that dialogue. I've since brought in some other sources. So I think saying what's on your mind and asking for a more relevant curriculum is really important.
Just want to add quickly something on the power of the students and the fact that curriculum is given to you. It's not like this is it, this is the truth. You take this, and if you see there are problems, issues, and sort of discrepancies or anything that doesn't make sense, you can bring it up with your student, with your school. And one example from Afghanistan, I remember during a regime change that happened after the Cold War, students have started to get these books with sort of very strange essays and topics that dealt with guns and bullets and things like that. And it was because the former Mujahideen was the government, and with that came along books that were very strange. And I think that there were a lot of discussion and dialogue about the merits of types of books that were given to students that were printed in other countries and came along. And I think that, I don't remember the exact details of that, but after some efforts, the civil society and parents and some association were able to put pressure to remove some of the very disturbing material in the curriculum for young students. So.
Yeah, and another question is actually for you also. How does one go about finding a good mentor?
I think it's sort of a matchmaking, a soul search, I would say. You always look for up to either in your family, in school, sometimes even online in some healthy associations that you're a member. And I think that by asking the right questions, and don't feel shy to say you need something, but also show at the same time that you have done work, but there's one burning question I have: how can I get help with this? And I think a lot of people who have done something in their life, they love to serve. It makes them feel good. If you come with some question and you see that that person is willing and enthusiastic in answering your question, ask another. So if they still do it, and the third time you find your soulmates for academic and education efforts. And sometimes actually you can directly ask them, would you want to be my mentor in my journey from, say, high school to college, or from, some extracurricular activity that you have? I think that if you're constantly on the search, you will get it. And sometimes it's luck. In one of my mentors, actually, it was a luck. Something happened with my sister that he was her mentor, and I asked questions, and he was happy to help. I was in Afghanistan, he was in the US, and actually he ultimately helped me earn a scholarship, come study, get quality education we talk about in the US. So I would say constantly look for one, and you would feel it that he's or she's the right person to be your mentor.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Ivana, for the questions. I also have a question to you, Mr. Rasoye. There is a big discussion in the UN in regards to prevention and preventing conflicts. So the importance of working on prevention instead of working on the peace operation in the conflict. So I know if you get my point, but what should be the youth's role in prevention in areas that might have sort of conflict in the future, and what is this what how should the people should be educated in terms of prevention for wars and conflicts, and also as we know, a lot of young people are recruited for to be part of militias and guerrillas, and we we need to educate these young people to not to participate in these counter movements. What do you think that should be a key of preventing these kind of issues of having youth involved in conflicts?
Yeah, I mean that's really big question and requires some research or preparation. Role of youth in preventing conflict or serious issues in a country. I think that youth again can do a lot. Um, um, I would say first of all, you start from yourself, which is that um, align yourself with the right people. See who is the stay away from bad company. I think that that's a major thing. In a lot of conflict countries, I think there is a question of radicalization. Of course, because of that energy that you have, the youth, they are also at risk of getting radicalized by some ideologies because that's the energy, the passion that comes from youth. So you can channel that into right or wrong. Um, um, I would say again, you start from yourself. You want to align yourself with the right people, with the right groups, and stay away from groups that you feel they would have some influence on you, bad influence on you, and again, I mean, big picture, it's a lot of times the job of the governments, the United Nations, of course, all the time make efforts and go everywhere, but there's so much the people themselves that can help themselves. The youth again comes in, their role comes, I would say, in terms of say forming whoever feels the passion to lead other youth to form a healthy civic group to sort of, I wouldn't say counter getting the radicalizing groups, but just your presence, creating groups that are healthy, kind of balances, because it's a reality of life and fortune in some conflict countries that there are groups who get radicalized easily. So just your presence is helpful. And I'm just thinking off the top of my head right now what youth can do, and I would say also write and participate in the discourse in your country, and you see an issue, start writing for for your school, for small newspapers, and you can practice your writing as well, and that will also help with your search for a job, but at the same time you're contributing something to the civil society. So these are some of the examples I can think of right now.
Thank you very much, Ms. Ayat. I have another question to Professor Closer. So I know you are writing a book now that that gives philosophical treatment of rumor and gossip. So that is a very interesting topic, and I would like to ask you, have you including any cases for the young people, especially in high schools or colleges? Yeah.
Well, gossip, of course, something that we see in small groups, and so classrooms, clubs, things like this. That's kind of the perfect environment for things like gossip. And also, you think about gossip. Gossip is, I think of it, it's a kind of speech act that involves a kind of behind the back quality to it. So it's a kind of aggression that's based, a sort of in which we share our opinions, for example, or our thoughts about someone when the person's not in the room. So there is a kind of behind the back kind of subtle manipulation quality to gossip that I think can happen, especially with young people, because you know, when you're young, you get to a point where you're trained to not be aggressive overtly with each other, right? So gossip can become an easy replacement for that. We could gossip about people or spread rumors about them and so on. So that's kind of a more socially acceptable, let's say, replacement for overt or like obvious aggression towards each other. So I think gossip is something that's very important for young people as well because it involves a hierarchy too. We gossip in a way where we form alliances against someone else. So it's about alliance forming, especially. And so young people are still maybe have quite a sense of where they are in the social hierarchy yet. And their hierarchies are constantly shifting with school, their family, work, and stuff, and things like this. Well, gossip can happen in those contexts because they're still jockeying some ways for position. And so one way to put yourself up is often to put somebody else down. So gossip can definitely happen among the young.
Thank you very much. This is very interesting
Yeah.
matter to talk about. Lastly, we have a couple minutes left, and I would like to hear from both of you your perspective on the importance of collective work of the youth and gathering into groups and sharing their thoughts and working together. We here in the DPI NGO, we have the youth seat committee and we have around 20 people working together towards one goal that it's basically expand and get the word spread the word of what is global citizenship and education for global citizenship. And I would like to hear your comments in regards to this importance of having young people to gather in groups and to communicate with each other and come with thoughts and work together and bring up something that could be useful for society. So I don't know if you could give me an example of your experience with that. As a professor, having young students gathering together and collecting and coming with the innovative thoughts or ideas for something. And also, in your experience, especially in Afghanistan, when you've seen students coming together, fighting for one cause. And yeah, so I think it's pretty interesting to discuss.
I always see that many of the great social changes that have occurred were really instigated by the young. So it's the young people who change the world most often. So I think now about the movements in the United States, for example, the Black Lives Matter movement, or either back when the Occupy Wall Street movement. These were all very committed these are all very committed young people working together for, to institute change. And so if we think that I think older generations tend to not acknowledge the power, and maybe the young people themselves don't acknowledge the power that they have in changing the world. Not only do they have the energy and now the autonomy as they're entering adulthood, but they have new ways of thinking about things and new ways of connecting with each other. And so the future really lies with them, and for good or for bad.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you can't overestimate really the power of collective of youth, whatever form they have. Like the professor mentioned, it is usually youth movements that cause changes in the world. So I would absolutely agree with that point. And again, mention that individuals make changes, and especially if you're young, you have energy and time. And imagine now that there are a collection of like-minded people with the same energy. That absolutely should know the power of that. And I'm gonna, again, from my experience in Afghanistan, I would say that, you know, be careful, because there are a lot of groups, sometimes not so much conspicuous, that they get you in the wrong place. They get you in trouble, they train you bad, and you end up regretting your life. So stay away from those type of groups. Join the other groups that are healthy and good, and again, your mere presence makes a difference. And in Afghanistan, there are a lot of youth groups, Muslim successful, and they are part of the growing civil society that I mentioned, in addition to so many other members of this civil society, women groups, art, education. Um, um, so youth do have a lot of groups, and mostly they use social media in forming the group, in declaring their constitution, and communicate that way. There is so much that sometimes some people it's like oversaturated in some contexts. It's all like forming a group on social media but not getting much done. But I would say that's not the case. Again, you know, you're filling the cyberspace with something useful. Again, that's something to counter the threats that you have from radicalization, from other sort of negative groups that exist in your society. In your society. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your comments. I have that question especially because last Thursday we had a pre-conference at the headquarters, and one of the topics was youth as agents of change, and how important it is to us come together as a group and discuss ideas and come up with changes for the better. And so I encourage everyone who is online to participate in this. In all these discussions that we have in the Google Hangouts, and also in the conference in Korea. And it is very important that you participate and you tell us what you think, your opinion, your voice is your voice matter. And we are very pleased to hear your comments and your feedback in all the events that we hold as YouTube committee. And thank you very much for being here and participate with us. Final comments for our great speakers today.
I just want to encourage you to, you know, learn, whether it's formally or informally, and you know, think as deeply as you can about these issues. They're very important to you, to everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, take advantage of the energy and time that you have. Be resilient, pursue your goals, and you'll get there if you believe in yourself.
And also, please log on to worldwewant2030.org to answer a few questions about global citizenship and help us create more change, as we've been speaking about today. And also, our next Google Hangouts will be on May 14th, and it will be about outreach and advocacy. So please join us. Awesome.
So thank you very much, everyone, for participating in this third Google Hangout. My name is Juan Pablo Celis, and we are very happy to have your participation here. Thank you.
Thank you.